Thank you for coming this afternoon. I think it's always important to kind of indicate why you tell a story and what got you interested in somebody like a Civil War Union cavalry general who was probably not as well known as Phil Sheridan or Jeb Stuart. And General Gregg was a very, very quiet, modest man. Well, my interest in Gregg took place mostly because of where I grew up. I grew up near 4th and Douglas in Reading. A block away from me, across from what is now the Red Cross building, is the equestrian statue of David Gregg. I remember running around that statue as a 5 or 6-year-old playing tag. And then 2 doors away from my home was the home of a woman by the name of Hazel Cox Gregg. And surprisingly enough, she was the daughter-in-law of the general. It seems as though the general had 2 sons, both born, I think one was born in 1867, another in 1869, and his youngest son, when he was in his mid to late 50s, married a woman in her late 20s.
All right. Where's his statue?
And the interesting thing is then that widow of David Gregg the Younger lived until about 1980. As a little boy of maybe 5 or so, I remember the son of the general, David Gregg. He probably looked much like his father, although he had a very long white beard. And I remember one vision. He would sit in a wicker chair with a garden hose, watering a postage stamp sized lawn in front of a row home on Douglas Street. He died around 1950 or 51. But Hazel, his widow, my neighbor, lived until 1980. By 1980, I was long out of school, out of college. I was working as a teacher, but she always knew of my interest in the Civil War. And when she passed away, she had no very close relatives. I think she had a niece that lived in Wyomissing. And she had told that niece, give what's left of the general's books to that nice young man who used to cut her grass or put in her storm windows and things like that. So I inherited, maybe 3 dozen of the general's books. I'm going to pass one around now. I have a lot of other books in the back maybe you want to look at later, but I'm going to give you a piece of living history from General Gregg's life, because here is one of his textbooks when he was a student at West Point. Dale, when he gave his talk, talked about how rigorous an engineering school West Point was. I took one look at this book, and I said, wow, I don't understand any of this. The title is Mummer's Astronomy. To me, it looks like a physics book, but I was not a mathematician. But this was his textbook as a student, where he was from 1851 to 1855 at West Point. And handle it carefully, but certainly take a good look at it. And you will see, like many students, he doodled on the inside cover and the rear cover of this book. So here's David Gregg's astronomy book. Some of the books in the Gregg collection weren't in too good condition, but some were. And there's one more I want to pass around. And this is a book written by Colonel James Kidd, who was the commanding officer of the 5th Michigan Cavalry, one of the units that served David Gregg for long periods of time, and at the Battle of Gettysburg, was the 5th Michigan Cavalry. They weren't under his direct command. They were under Custer's command, but Gregg kept Custer at a very strategic point during the Battle of Gettysburg, and so Colonel Kidd got to know of and respect General Gregg very much, and their paths crossed many times. So I'll pass this around. You can kind of take a look at another one of the books that belong to David Gregg. David Gregg, in fact, when Dale gave me the dates to speak, I should have thought, well, maybe I should pick April 10th. That was 2 weeks ago. That is David Gregg's birthday. April 10th, 1833, David Gregg was born in central Pennsylvania, in Huntington, Pennsylvania. He was the 3rd of 9 children. His father was a semi-successful lawyer. His father came from a prominent family, though. His father was the grandson of a United States senator and a member of the cabinet of Governor Joseph Easter. You might recognize the name Andrew Gregg Curtin. Andrew Gregg Curtin was the Civil War governor of Pennsylvania and a cousin of David Gregg. The Greggs were a prominent family. David Gregg's mother's maiden name was McMurtie, which was also a very well-known name in central Pennsylvania. Now, I mentioned that Matthew Gregg, David's father, was not more than an average lawyer, and perhaps he didn't really care too much about the profession. And when David was about 15, or maybe I'll backtrack one moment. I want to establish something before I go on. It seems as though from an early age, David Gregg liked to ride horses. Some of you are familiar with a little town near State College of Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. David had an older brother, Andrew, and when they were about 8 and 10, 9 and 11 or so, they would hang out in front of the local hotel in Bellefonte. And when travelers to town came in to stay at the hotel, the Gregg boys would offer to water and stable their horses. And usually that involved, as soon as they could get out of sight of the owner of the horse, them racing the horses to the local stream and then bringing the horses back to the stable. There's evidence that some of the old guys who would sit in the bench outside the hotel would always enjoy the show the Gregg boys put on with the horses. When David was 15, his father and his uncle decided to go on an adventure. Now, in that area of Pennsylvania, in the Juniata Valley, upper Juniata Valley, not too far from State College, there were a lot of iron forges. There was a lot of limestone. The iron industry was flourishing. So the Gregg brothers decided that they wanted to buy and operate an iron forge. Well, it's not something you probably can secure at your local Walmart. You got to hunt for one. And most of the attractive iron forges in central and north central Pennsylvania were, already owned and operated. So they looked and looked and looked, and they found an old iron forge that had been out of production for a while in northern Virginia. I don't know whether you're familiar with, I guess it's Route 15, Point of Rocks and Leesburg. If you go down Route 15 and you cross the Potomac, they found a place called Potomac Furnace. It was about halfway between Point of Rocks and Leesburg, and they, in the spring of 1848, moved to Virginia. Well, things didn't turn out too well. They worked very hard to try to get this forge in production. They probably moved down there in late March, early April. Both David's father and his uncle got sick. His father died toward the end of July, and his uncle died about a week later of some kind of swamp fever, malarial type illness. And Mrs. Gregg is left with 9 children and a non-functioning iron forge. She had a lot of relatives. She had 10 brothers and sisters. And there was some support for the family. They moved back up to Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania. Mrs. Gregg and her 9 children. She was totally shattered by this experience and was not well herself. Relatives helped. They tried to keep the family together. And it developed that she was probably suffering from tuberculosis, and she was sent to a sanitarium at Bedford Springs, Pennsylvania, hopefully to be cured. I guess it was about the late summer of 1849, maybe. The family's in their home in Hollidaysburg. I told this story one time to Charlie Adams. He got a kick out of it because Charlie Adams, of course, is interested in ghosts. But the way the story goes is that on a late August night, the 9 children are in the house, and they see a face at the front window. Some of the younger kids think it's mother returning home. They start yelling and screaming for joy, thinking mother is there. Open the door, and of course no one is there. Next morning, they receive word that their mother has passed away at Bedford Springs. That's a family story that David Gregg often told. A lot of the personal information on David Gregg comes from a book that his son tried to write. It's an unpublished manuscript. It's pretty long. There are 2 copies. One's in the Berks County Historical Society, which of course is available, and the other is in the Library of Congress. So information of a personal note on Gregg's family has been supplied by the son. I've seen the book, and there's a lot of information in it. Well, now, both his parents are deceased. He had an older brother and an older sister, but his older brother, Andrew, was 2 years older. I think he was 15 when, or 16 when the mother died. He and Andrew are sent now to private school in that area of Pennsylvania. And at one point, they spend a year in private school, and this would be about 1850 perhaps, at a place called Lewisburg University, which of course now is Bucknell. While both attending school there, I guess it was the end of December of 1851, they are allowed to take a recess together, and they go and spend time in Philadelphia. Late 1851, they're on recess in Philadelphia, and now Andrew Gregg, David's older brother, becomes sick. Essentially, he has consumption. The family agrees to allow David to stay with his older brother in Philadelphia temporarily. And fortunately, at this time, word comes that Uncle Robert McMurtie has somehow secured an appointment at West Point for David. Robert McMurtie was a politician, a lawyer, generally thought of very highly. There was a new U.S. representative to be elected from the newly formed Blair County, and Robert McMurtie got David an appointment at West Point. A few months later, March of 1851, they take Andrew Gregg back to central Pennsylvania. He doesn't live more than a few weeks, and he dies. So now David's lost both parents and his older brother. Before the end of the year is up, he loses also his 3-year-old sister, his youngest sister. So he's had some family, certainly tragedies, that a lot of young men may not experience. And in June of 1851, he arrives at West Point to begin his cadet year that September. 1851. There are 74 students in his incoming class, and some of the names read like kind of a who's who of who is going to become well known in the Civil War. Jeb Stuart is 1 year ahead of him. Phil Sheridan is 2 years ahead of him. I don't know whether any of you heard about the story of Phil Sheridan at West Point, where he was suspended for a year for fighting an upperclassman. He was lucky he was not dismissed. During David Gregg's second and third year at West Point, a fellow by the name of Robert E. Lee was the commandant of the school. His best friend at West Point was a fellow by the name of Dorsey Pender, who later became a Confederate general and suffered a wound at Gettysburg that cost him his life. Number 1 in the class that year was a fellow by the name of Comstock. Dale, do you remember a guy named Comstock? I can't recall his first name, but he finished number 1, and Comstock became the official chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac later on. He also built a lot of the fortifications in Washington. Dale and I were kidding about how rigorous the engineering curriculum was, and if you were number 1 in your class on graduation day, you were supposed to display your knowledge in some way with an example of what you could do. Young graduate Comstock froze up completely and he couldn't remember any of it. It didn't affect his class rank or his future assignment or career, but it was one of those things that I guess can happen when you stand in front of a group of people. One other notable thing happened while David was at West Point. At graduation in 1854, at a dance, he met a young lady. This was kind of an arranged meeting. Her name was Ellen Sheaf. She was actually the granddaughter of Governor Joseph Easter of Pennsylvania. She was just visiting West Point with her aunt from Reading. And of course, David's grandfather was in Easter's cabinet and a former U.S. senator from Pennsylvania. So these two young people had kind of an arranged introduction. That was in 1854. 8 years later, they would be married. You graduate from West Point. Your class rank is pretty good, 8 out of 34. You may have some choice in what your branch is. And of course, it's a no-brainer for Gregg. He chooses the cavalry. He was an excellent rider. In fact, they tell stories about him at West Point. They had a favorite horse that nobody could ride at West Point named Old Bumper. And it appears as though David Gregg could subdue Old Bumper very well. And of course, That was another example of his riding prowess. If you graduated from West Point in 1855, you knew you were going west. His first assignment was a drill instructor at Jefferson Barracks in Missouri, and then for the next 5 years, he had a tour of the West, from Texas to Arizona to Mexico to California to the Washington Territory to Oregon Territory, and most of it involved Indians. A lot of young officers earned their spurs, so to speak, doing Indian fighting. In many of those assignments, he was in the same unit as Dorsey Pender. He had a lot of hair-raising escapes and close calls as an Indian fighter, and I'm sure you have access to that in the history books, but we certainly don't have time to go into all of that now. As the 1850s concluded, war clouds are forming. There's a lot of discussions between the young officers about who's going to do what if the southern states start to secede. And some of it gets pretty hot and heavy. Gregg was not an abolitionist. Pender was not a fire eater. They were kind of middle of the road, steady young men, but they each knew where they were going to go if an explosion took place. And of course, that explosion took place at Fort Sumter in April of 1861. And the young officers were all told to report east. To get from the West Coast to his place to report, which was New York City, he did not come overland. He came by boat to the Isthmus of Panama, across the Isthmus of Panama, and then up to New York. On that boat, he became acquainted with an older young officer, a captain by the name of Winfield Scott Hancock. In fact, I don't know how it happened. As a lieutenant, Gregg somehow had gotten a stateroom on this ship. He gave his stateroom to Captain Hancock and his wife. Probably around that time, they could trace the beginning of a very, very fine friendship. The young officers arrive in New York, and now we have kind of a humorous story. Hey, this has been a rough sea voyage. They're going to embark on who knows what kind of career. They're going to go out and celebrate. I kind of refer to this as the story of the bad oysters. Young men go out, they party, and they eat a tremendous number of oysters. And Gregg and a couple of the other fellows wind up sick to death in a hotel room. And Hancock and the other guys say, we're going to Washington, and by the time you get well, the war will be over. Right. Gregg receives a commission as a captain in the U.S. Cavalry Regulars. And then, probably because of his cousin's influence, receives a colonelcy in the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry. But it's not quite time for him to make his military debut. He shows up to Washington, reports to Washington in the fall of 1861. You would think sometimes this guy is unlucky, but now he contracts typhoid fever. He's put in a military hospital in Washington, D.C., suffering from typhoid fever. The hospital catches on fire. One of the other troopers in the hospital has to carry him out of the hospital to save his life. Do you think he's jinxed?
I'd be running away from him by now.
Well, that's about it in terms of, the life's bad breaks. He is now ready to begin his career. Of course, there isn't much action in the early part of 1862. But when McClellan is assigned to the peninsula or takes his army to the peninsula, the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry goes along. And throughout the time McClellan is on the peninsula, Gregg is there. McClellan and many other generals just basically had no clue on how to use the cavalry. They were basically used as provost troops, guarding supply trains, headquarters detachments, honor guards. They were really fragmented and never put into a cohesive fighting unit of any kind. So while they were there, they didn't see an awful lot of action on the peninsula. And Gregg would speak out about this later, often, the misuse of the cavalry. After his experiences on the peninsula and the movement is away, I think Gregg's 8th Cavalry did cover the retreat of the Union Army from Harrison's Landing to Yorktown. But now, of course, in early 1862, after the Peninsula Campaign is over, the 7 Days battles are over, we're focusing now much more on what's going to happen in Virginia. McClellan is still in charge of the Union Army, and we can kind of jump forward now to perhaps the Battle of Antietam. Essentially, the Union cavalry was kept in reserve at the Battle of Antietam. Saw very little in the way of action. In fact, a lot of McClellan's troops didn't see any action. A lot of his infantry didn't. Must have been very, very frustrating. And of course, finally, Lincoln becomes totally frustrated with McClellan, and of course, he's removed from command, and Burnside is put in command of the Army of the Potomac. If McClellan was too cautious, Burnside is perhaps just the opposite, too rash. Slowly but surely, they move to the Rappahannock. They're across the river from Fredericksburg, and most of us know what happens at Fredericksburg. Burnside is slow in getting the pontoons up, or somebody's slow. The Confederates are dug in Mary's Heights, and it's a debacle. What did the Union cavalry do during the Battle of Fredericksburg? Nothing. They were once again held in reserve. However, they weren't out of artillery range. And a General Bayard, I think I pronounced it correctly, B-A-Y-A-R-D, who's a commanding officer of Union cavalry. He's one of the 2 or 3 Union cavalry killed at the Battle of Fredericksburg. He's essentially struck by an errant artillery shell. A few days after that takes place, David Gregg becomes a brigadier general in the United States Army. So by the end of the year of 1862, yes, Rodney?
Is this now the volunteer army, or does he get a brigadier?
No, he's been, no, it's volunteer. He was in the 8th Pennsylvania Volunteer Cavalry. He was transferred over, and of course, as you probably know, promotion came much more quickly if you were in the state volunteers than if you were in a regular army. The cavalry obviously didn't do much marching during the Mud March, and once again, there was a lot of frustration on the part of cavalrymen in terms of what to do. And of course, the Mud March leads to the demise of Burnside, and now enters Fighting Joe Hooker as the commanding general for the Army of the Potomac. And to some extent, we have to give Hooker credit for a reorganization. It greatly improves living conditions, food, morale, and there is probably a esprit de corps that didn't exist under Burnside. And basically, Hooker does some rearranging of the cavalry, which seems to make some sense. A fellow by the name of George Stoneman is put in charge of the Union cavalry. He has an interesting track record. It's kind of mixed. A lot of people dismiss him as somewhat incompetent, but he was respected by his men, for one thing. He was a pro. One of the Union officers that tremendously respected him was a fellow named John Buford. Late April of 1862, Hooker now is moving. He's moving to what will eventually evolve into the battle at Chancellorsville. But before that battle takes place, he decides to test his cavalry on a raid toward Richmond, where they're going to try to do a lot of damage to the Confederate infrastructure. And on that raid, Stoneman leads, but Buford and Gregg and a fellow by the name of William Averill, they all are participating in this huge raid. It's ordered by General Joe Hooker. One Union cavalry officer remains with Hooker, a fellow by the name of Alfred Pleasanton, who often has a reputation of liking to be always in at headquarters. Well, the raid has mixed results. At first, it's reported that it's very successful. Hooker gives information to Stanton that it is successful. Tremendous amount of damage done. Problem is, a river has rose, and it's very difficult for the Union cavalry to get back to the Army of the Potomac. In the meantime, the Battle of Chancellorsville takes place, which is a devastating Union defeat. Hooker has to find a scapegoat. It couldn't have been his fault. And Craig, you really developed that very well, that his command processor procedures were not all that successful, or I guess successful would be the best word. Well, the blame focused on Stoneman results in Stoneman being relieved. And of course, who's put in charge of the Union cavalry? Alfred Pleasanton, who was probably whispering in Hooker's ear the whole time. And now the gentleman who is nicknamed, for good reason probably, the Prince of Romance, Alfred Pleasanton, becomes the head of the cavalry for the Army of the Potomac. Most people did not really have a lot of respect for Pleasanton. He was, in a way, the antithesis of Gregg. Gregg, on any number of occasions, said, I am not going to either be a newspaper or a picture general. Pleasanton reported to the newspapers as much as anybody else, and was always telling them of his great accomplishments, always telling everybody of his great accomplishments, and did not have the respect of his subordinates. 11 days. Sometimes only a few days kind of make a difference. One of the interesting things, what ifs. General Pleasanton had 11 days, just 11 days of seniority over John Buford. What a difference that would have made. Hooker said he would have liked to, or maybe considered, Buford to be commanding officer of the Union cavalry in the Army of Potomac. But unless he found some way to get Pleasanton out of there, the seniority system didn't allow that. Speaking about John Buford, he might have had another handicap. Secretary of War didn't like him. Stanton did not like any Union general who was born south of the Mason-Dixon line. Buford was from Kentucky. Stanton didn't trust Southerners who stayed in the Union Army for the most part. And while Stanton didn't trust Southerners in the Union Army, Pleasanton had a little thing about foreigners in the Union Army. He didn't like them either, whether it was the Englishman Percy Wyndham or the Frenchman Alfred Dufay, or any of the German officers. He seemed to be determined to get them out of the Army. Well, the Union cavalry now is basically divided into 3 corps, with this all of the arrangement by Hooker. Gregg is a division commander. Buford is a division commander. Kilpatrick is a division commander. Kilpatrick's another officer, another Union cavalry general who doesn't show up as having perhaps all the stellar qualities you would want, and is really going to be a problem for a lot of people, but he was a favorite of Pleasanton. And then, of course, we come to, in very late April or early May, the Battle of Brandy Station. Before we get to that, I want to talk about something that happened in early April. April 6th, 1863. David Gregg gets a chance to meet President Lincoln. On April 6th, 1863, Hooker arranges to have the president review David Gregg's 2nd Cavalry Division. This is quite an honor. Lincoln and his wife show up. Troops are lined up. Gregg and Lincoln are going to ride in front of the row of lined up Union horse soldiers, review them. Now, something happened that morning that maybe disturbed David Gregg a little bit. He went to the stable and he realized that neither one of his usual horses was fit for some reason. He needed a horse. Now, one of the honored units in Gregg's command was the 1st Maine Cavalry. And he met one of the troopers from the 1st Maine who said, you know, there's a horse available if you want to use it. Huge, handsome bay, beautiful looking animal. Gregg is this experienced rider, and he's thinking, well, this will work. Well, as they're riding down, he and Lincoln in front of the line, the regimental band strikes up. this horse that Gregg is on rears up and starts off with a gallop. Lincoln, on a much smaller horse with long legs almost touching the ground, has to hang on for his dear life as his horse gallops alongside Gregg's horse. Gregg is sufficiently humiliated and embarrassed. I mean, what happens if the president is injured? And as they return to the reviewing stand, Lincoln mumbles something about the exciting ride he just had. He's not critical. And then Lincoln desires to introduce David Gregg to Mrs. Lincoln. And the regimental band strikes up again, and Gregg's horse rears up, probably scaring the life out of Mrs. Lincoln. And so this was the review. Gregg is angry. Later that...
He shot that horse.
No, he rode that horse for 2 more years. He mastered that horse, and it was a wonderful horse. In fact, he gave it back to an officer 2 years later in the 1st Maine. But he wanted to find out the background of that horse after this embarrassing incident. And he does find out about the background of that horse, and he goes to somebody in the 1st Maine and wants to know what the deal is. And he's told that the previous owner is recovering in the hospital from broken ribs. So that's how he got the horse. That's one of those anecdotes that, you know, kind of adds a little humor to what is a very, very serious war. The Battle of Brandy Station. Often it's described as one of the largest cavalry battles of the war. It's possible that Trevilian Station is larger. But Pleasanton has a plan to surprise Jeb Stuart and the Confederate cavalry. And Jeb Stuart, of course, a day or so before this fighting breaks out in the area of Brandy Station, has had his own review of troops where Lee has come and reviewed the Confederate cavalry. Well, for Gregg and for the Union cavalry, Brandy Station is a big, close, very close to a tremendous success. Buford and Gregg are supposed to coordinate. They cross the Rappahannock at different locations. Actually, Gregg has a couple other brigades of cavalry with him other than his own division, 2 brigades led by General Alfred Dufay, the Frenchman. And Buford arrives into a situation where hostilities begin hours before Gregg gets across the river. The plan was for Gregg to wait for Dufay, who showed up late. Gregg gets across the river, approaches this area that's described Fleetwood Hill, and they've almost achieved total surprise of Jeb Stuart. There are only a few headquarters staffers at the top of Fleetwood Hill. There is one cannon that had been retired from action because it had just about been, had its ammunition used up. Fleetwood Hill is essentially empty. One of Jeb Stuart's subordinates, a fellow by the name of McClellan, who was actually a cousin of the Union McClellan, sees the Union cavalry coming toward Fleetwood Hill, rolls this one cannon out. There's only a few rounds left, and begins slowly and methodically firing them. The lead brigade for Gregg is led by a fellow by the name of Percy Wyndham, a big Englishman with a huge walrus mustache, who's a pretty accomplished cavalry general, but also a big mouth. And Percy Wyndham and/or Gregg, and nobody is quite sure which, perceives that there might be some opposition up there where that cannon is firing a few methodical rounds. And they spend maybe a half an hour or so calling up some Union artillery. It really gives the Confederates 30 minutes of precious time. The Union forces charge up the hill. They're met at the top of the hill by Confederate forces, and there is a very, very close, hotly contested battle back and forth for several hours. Stuart was really caught with his pants down. He was surprised, and he was also very lucky he got away with it. After heavy fighting from Buford's troops and Gregg's troops, they're finally recalled, and they only very slowly recross the river. They're not chased. There's no follow-up. So if it's a victory for the Confederates, it's because the Union troopers went away. They certainly were not defeated in combat. But perhaps its most value, the Battle of Brandy Station, gave the Union cavalry confidence. I didn't talk about that. There was really a gap in performance between the Confederate cavalry and the Union cavalry in the early years of the war. Southerners were used to riding horses much more than Northerners. They were perhaps much more used to using firearms from horses. They had good leadership. Early in the war, and Gregg made a point of this one time, going back to the days of Winfield Scott, at the very beginning of the war, nobody wanted to invest in the Union cavalry. Number one, they thought the war would be very short. They thought it would be too expensive to equip Union cavalry. And they didn't think it would be cost effective. It took Jeb Stuart a couple times literally riding around the Union cavalry and realizing how much damage he caused, that maybe it would be cost effective. So for a long time, the Union cavalry was second fiddle. McClellan didn't use it properly. Hooker didn't use it. Certainly Burnside hadn't used it. Now it's going to be kind of questionable how well Pleasanton used it. Now Pleasanton bragged about a lot of things, but he bragged that Brandy Station gave him the information that Lee's army was moving north to Pennsylvania. Most historians disagree with that. Most historians disagree that Pleasanton was able to get any information for Hooker on the movements of Robert E. Lee down the valley, headed toward Maryland and Pennsylvania. And one other thing about Pleasanton that became apparent, he always somehow managed to grossly exaggerate the size of the enemy, and Hooker seemed to like that too. He did likewise. And of course, you probably all know why Hooker resigned his command not too long before Gettysburg. He wanted that garrison of 10,000 soldiers at Harper's Ferry to be added to his army, and Halleck and Stanton and Lincoln, nobody would give him those 10,000 soldiers. So he tendered his resignation. And of course, George Meade now assumes command of the Union Army and is the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Union cavalry did very well at Gettysburg for the most part. Just checking the time here. First day, Yes.
David, I just recently read an article that after the Battle of Brandy Station, that Stuart is so upset that Lee kind of gives him a free will to go up to Pennsylvania. That's why he went east instead of helping the Confederate Army. He was so upset about what happened at Brandy Station that Lee basically allowed him to go up and raise Cain, heading up toward Pennsylvania, but he went the wrong direction.
Well, I think you could speculate on that, but a lot of us know, Lee was pretty used to giving discretionary orders. He gave discretionary orders to Stonewall Jackson, and it worked. And a lot of times he gave discretionary orders to Jeb Stuart. And of course, that's part of the controversy over Lee's ride to Gettysburg. Did Stuart act within those discretionary orders? First day at Gettysburg, John Buford is certainly a hero. He holds off the Confederates long enough for Reynolds to arrive and really saves the day. Buford's cavalry, though, was in bad shape after day one at Gettysburg. And they're essentially removed from the battlefield, sent back to Maryland to re-equip, rest, get their act together again, recover. So after the first day, Buford is not a factor. The two other divisions going to Gettysburg are Gregg's division and Kilpatrick's division. Kilpatrick is eventually going to be assigned to the western part of the line, or the left part of the line. One of the things I think most of us, after being confused for a long time, at the Battle of Gettysburg, basically the Confederates were approaching from the north or northwest, and the Union forces were coming up from the south. So Kilpatrick is supposed to be on the west end of the battlefield. Gregg is supposed to be on the eastern flank, or the right side of the battlefield, protecting that flank. On day two, Gregg is on the eastern flank. He sees a lot of things going on in the area of Culp's Hill. He realizes that he should line up tight against the Union lines on the eastern end of the battlefield. Here, I'll pass one of these out. It's not the greatest map, but it's a map of the battlefield at Gettysburg on the third day. Well, Gregg and his cavalry make sure there's no gap between the Union infantry and the Union cavalry on that eastern flank. In fact, they occupy the former Stonewall Brigade, led by General Walker, and his troops, 1,400 or so, very, very high-quality troops, cannot participate in the attack, Confederate attack, to take Culp's Hill. He kind of holds them in position. During the afternoon and evening of the second day, Gregg is pretty well ensconced on that right flank. Now, Gregg, his men are worn out. They've had a very hard trip to Gettysburg, and he only has two of his three brigades. His third brigade, under Colonel Pennock Huey, is down in Maryland. So he has two brigades, maybe totaling 3,000 men or a little less. It's kind of estimated that perhaps the Confederate cavalry have somewhere in the area of 7,500 men. So, dawn of day three, Kilpatrick's troops have been moving from east to west. Pleasonton has ordered them to that western side of the battlefield. And Kilpatrick has really two brigades, one belonging to Farnsworth and one belonging to Custer. And Custer has 4 relatively large, mostly experienced cavalry brigades. There's something I wanted to read at one point. If I can find it quickly, I will. But now there comes a time when, in a way, there's a misunderstanding, a countermanding of orders. As most of you know, superior officers on the scene can countermand orders if they see an emergency brewing. There's a quote here that I wanted to read. I have a lot of quotes I wrote down, but the sequence of who obeyed what order is that Gregg was basically told to move to a certain position, suggested to General Pleasanton that that was not a good idea. Couriers were sent back and forth. And then, of course, the orders came from both Pleasanton and Kilpatrick for Custer to leave that east end, that eastern flank of the battlefield. In later years, when Custer was asked about this, he kind of indicated that he just wasn't aware of the order. He didn't see it. But what he did see was Jeb Stuart's cavalry to the north. In that area, if you have your map yet, up above the Rummel Farm, the Confederate cavalry is congregating. They were trying to remain conspicuous behind trees, and they didn't do a good job of it. They were observed. Not only were they observed by Gregg's troops, earlier, Oliver Howard's 11th Corps had observed the movement of the Confederate cavalry east along the York Pike, north of the Rummel Farm. So Union forces, Gregg was aware that the cavalry was moving, the Confederate cavalry was moving. Gregg was successful in making sure there was no seam where Stuart could split through a point between the end of the infantry and the beginning of the cavalry. So now if Stuart is going to get around the Union flank to cause damage, he's going to have to go all the way around. One of the biggest questions of the third day at Gettysburg was, were somehow Lee and Stuart coordinating an attack? We all know that there was a plan for Longstreet to order Pickett's charge on the afternoon of the third day. We all know there was going to be an artillery barrage before it. We don't know, nobody has ever said, although there are a few authors out there who pretend they know, that Lee and Stuart had a meeting and the decision was made that you, Stuart, go around the Union flank, attack the Union rear simultaneously with Pickett's charge toward Hancock. I think one thing we could conclude would be that as a very, very competent cavalryman, Stuart knew instinctively that that's what should be done. Whether you could have timed it or not accurately, with the distance involved, the sound of the artillery barrage, who knows? One thing mysterious that Stuart did that third day, maybe around noon, he fired off 4 shots from a cannon. one ostensibly in each direction for no apparent purpose. Now, there are some people who thought that was a signal to Lee that he was ready and in position. A lot of other people think that he was firing those 4 shots perhaps to flush out Union cavalry from wherever they were hiding or wherever they were placed. I kind of more think it was the second than the first. Well, getting back to this decision making, essentially to some extent, Gregg disobeyed Pleasanton's order, and to some or greater extent, Custer, who was subordinate, disobeyed Kilpatrick's order. Kilpatrick actually, before he found out what happened, wanted to have Custer court-martialed. If Gregg hadn't been successful with his strategy, Pleasanton might have wanted to have him court-martialed. They both took a chance. But here's the quote that I found. This individual asserts this to be true, as I've often said, that no man is fit to be an officer who has not the sense and courage to know when to disobey an order.
Sounds like Lord Milton.
Anybody want to guess who said that?
I'll guess Custer. Sounds like it.
No. Actually, it was a Confederate officer. John Singleton Mosby. Now think about that for a moment. Mosby was one of Stuart's biggest defenders. Absolutely went to the wall in defense of Jeb Stuart and his ride to Gettysburg, and that he wasn't disobeying orders. But I think we all know that Mosby was somewhat of an unconventional officer anyway. So, but maybe we could apply that, and I'm sure we've seen instances in history that officers have disobeyed orders and wound up heroes. Well, nobody was going to discipline Gregg after the third day, and nobody was going to discipline Custer after the third day. There is some thought, I guess, that Custer really won the battle in the third day in the East Cavalry Field. There seems to be a lot of solid historians and military men who think Gregg should receive more credit. Some of the books I have back there on the table seem to indicate that. That Gregg was the mastermind, not just on the third day, but also on the second day. He had his troops positioned very carefully. If you ever go out to the East Cavalry Field, what actually happened was that from the Rummel Farm south, the Confederate cavalry kind of was entering a funnel, a V-shaped or a funnel-shaped situation where they were meeting the mostly Michigan cavalry under Custer, but also some of Gregg's cavalry under McIntosh, and that what helped the Union so much was flanking attacks on both sides of the Confederate column. The Union also had a marked superiority in artillery in the third day at the East Cavalry Field, and it was very close. There's an author out there, I didn't bring his book in because I agree with Eric Wittenberg when Eric said it was trash. A fellow by the name of Tom Carhart has written a book a few years ago called Lost Triumph. And in that book, he really trashes David Gregg. He basically says that he knew there was this secret plan between Lee and Stuart, and that Gregg was just lucky. And that basically Gregg used Custer's troops as cannon fodder. And he wouldn't use his own troops. Of course, you could make the argument that Gregg had his own troops strategically placed first. There's maybe one little thing that Carhart said, which might have a certain degree of validity. This is very, very close. Custer had 4 brigades, the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 7th Michigan Cavalry. The rookie group was the 7th. They weren't experienced. They were pretty raw. And at one crucial juncture, Gregg is looking around. Who do I send in? And his thinking might have gone this way. Those young Wolverines in the 7th Brigade have no clue what they're in for. They're in a situation where they might not have any fear. They just want to fight. If I send one of the other brigades in, they're going to say, what the heck are we doing? So if that logic worked, maybe that's why Gregg chose them. And they did acquit themselves very well, even though they had the most casualties. They literally rode into a fence and got all jumbled up. And it wasn't a pretty picture. But at the end of the day, essentially Stuart's forces retreated to where the day had started. Gregg stayed where they were. And you could call it tactically a draw, but it was really a Union victory because it was up to Gregg to stop that flanking attack. All he had to do was stop it. He didn't have to win a battle. He stopped it. There was no chance for Stuart to get behind the Union center and cause havoc as Hancock was fighting off Pickett's charge. Gee, the war's only half over. One of the things to show you some of where Pleasanton's head was at. Within an hour or so after the battle ended, and all during the battle, Pleasanton was staying with Meade. Whether that's because Meade didn't want him to go somewhere or Pleasanton thought it was safer for him to be there, I'm not sure. But this is what Pleasanton, a subordinate, said to Meade. He said, after he congratulated him for the victory, he said, I will give you a half an hour to show yourself a great general. Order the army, the whole army, to advance, while I take the cavalry and get in Lee's rear, and we will finish the campaign in a week. Well, there was a considerable amount of disarray in the Union Army, certainly the Union cavalry. Buford's down in Maryland. Oh, I forgot to mention Kilpatrick's move at the end of the 3rd day. He wants glory. He's very disappointed that he hasn't gotten any on the 3rd day at Gettysburg. He only has one brigade left, and that's the brigade of young Elon Farnsworth. So on the other end of the Union line, many of you know the story, he orders a charge by Farnsworth's brigade, a lot of Vermont cavalrymen who are very, very good, and he orders that charge to take place in an area unfit for cavalry, rugged, rocky terrain. The Confederates are dug in, and Farnsworth at first objects. And essentially, Kilpatrick questions his courage. And finally, Farnsworth says, yes, I will lead the charge if you take responsibility for it. And of course, the charge takes place. Farnsworth is killed. His troops are decimated. And then Kilpatrick says a lot of nice things about him in his after-battle report. It's amazing they put up with Kilpatrick as long as they could or did. But now we all know kind of the story. After the Battle of Gettysburg, there's a very slow chase of Robert E. Lee. Probably some mistakes were made. He gets across the Potomac. He retreats into Virginia. And here we are by the end of 1863. The armies are almost where they were when the year started, on either side of the Rappahannock. It's not a good situation. There's skirmishing, there's action. Gregg participates, but not much comes of it. I want to say some things about Gregg's personal life a little bit, but before I conclude the fighting, I might say that the following spring, early March of 1864, everything changes. Lincoln has finally had it with Meade's slow movement. Grant is called in to take command of the Union armies. Meade is retained, but Grant is going to call the shots. Not only is Grant brought in, but a new commander of cavalry is finally brought in. Pleasanton is sent packing. Actually, Kilpatrick is sent packing too. Sheridan comes in. There's a brief interval of a couple of weeks before Sheridan arrives, where Gregg is commanding the entire cavalry arm of the Army of the Potomac. And when Sheridan takes over, Gregg is the only experienced division commander in the Union cavalry. There are other new people brought in. One of the mysteries for some historians seems to be what was the relationship between Grant and Sheridan, and I think I can clear that up. It wasn't good. I think Gregg did not trust Sheridan. I think at a place called Trevilian Station that Gregg felt he was put in such a vulnerable position that it wasn't safe to be taking orders from Sheridan. Sheridan claimed he never lost a battle in the whole overland campaign. He probably decisively won glory once, and that's when Jeb Stuart was killed at Yellow Tavern. But strategically, not much was gained. And of course, Eric Wittenberg from this area, who has written so much in the Union cavalry, he doesn't have a lot of good things to say about Phil Sheridan. The overland campaign was brutal, hard, grunt fighting. There was one little incident where, I guess in the summer or the fall of 1863, this is before Sheridan has arrived, Pleasanton's still in charge. Gregg's 2nd Division was supporting Warren's 2nd Corps. Meade, and it was a very, very difficult battle, Meade sent out a congratulatory message to the wonderful courage and bravery of the 2nd Corps under General Warren. Did not say anything about the 2nd Cavalry Division. Now, some of you might remember that Meade sometimes had a nickname, the old snapping turtle. Occasionally, Gregg had a nickname which was Mad Mac. Well, the snapping turtle and Mad Mac had a little difference of opinion. Gregg was so upset that his cavalry did not get recognition that he demanded a court of inquiry. And he said, if we don't have a court of inquiry, I respectfully request transfer out of the Army of the Potomac. Meade did back off. And he said, no slight was intended. It was inadvertent. I didn't mean to disrespect the 2nd Cavalry Division, and that kind of patched it up. But Gregg did have a little bit of a temper. He didn't show it that often. Some of these men did call him Mad Mac occasionally. And there were a few occasions where he actually got on a horse, led a charge, making funny noises, and I don't have to tell you about the respect he had from his men. He had that. Well, to end the war now, in August, after the overland campaign, just brutal, hard fighting, Jubal Early is raising hell in the Shenandoah Valley, and Sheridan now is dispatched from the Army of the Potomac to command the Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley, and takes 2 of the 3 cavalry divisions with him. Gregg now, until the end of 1864, is the whole ball of wax when it comes to the cavalry for the Army of the Potomac. He's in charge. And it is grunt work, not pretty, not glory, and a lot of people don't read or study too much about either the Overland campaign or the Petersburg campaign and the toll it took on the cavalry. And in December of 1864, Gregg takes a Christmas furlough, comes back to Reading, has a talk with his wife, his family, decides to resign. I wrote it down here somewhere. To make a long story short, he basically said, I am resigning for personal and private and business reasons. He didn't elaborate, never gave any more specifics on why he did it. Does anybody in here know Roy Garris? I talked to Roy on the phone the other day. Roy is a real student of the Civil War and very interested in David Gregg and the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry. And when I talked to Roy, and I've talked to him a few times in the past, I said, just off the top of your head, again, give me what your thought is on why David Gregg resigned. He used kind of an old-fashioned word. He said a lot of people in the Gregg family up in central Pennsylvania indicate that when Gregg came back at Christmas furlough, he had a hole in his hat, a bullet hole in his hat. And Roy used the word henpecked. That basically Gregg was persuaded by a very beautiful woman who was his wife. By all accounts, Ellen Sheaf was absolutely gorgeous. Now, there are other reasons he might have resigned. Edward Longacre has access or read a letter written by a regimental surgeon that says that Gregg told him that he was afraid of dying in battle and perhaps he was a coward. Now, this is a man who had several horses shot out from under him and was in the forefront of a lot of action. I didn't see necessarily a lot of combat in Vietnam, but I think you could ask a lot of people in the military, are you afraid of dying in battle? And you would say yes. I don't know whether that automatically makes you a coward. Somebody suggested that perhaps David Gregg had post-traumatic stress disorder, that he had seen really almost 3 years of uninterrupted combat.
Well, that would have been compensable, right?
In what way?
Well, you get all kinds of money back from the government.
In 1865.
Sure.
So I,
Just as a question, how come they could just quit?
that's a very good question. I often wondered that, but when he
You
did
get in trouble if you do that now.
well, yeah. Well, I don't know whether generals can resign or not. Can they? If they have enough time in? I don't know.
He resigned
But
from federal?
Yes, yeah. But it's interesting that when he resigned, nobody asked him to stay. Meade or Grant could have said, you know, maybe you want to think about it a little bit. He got some backhanded compliments, certainly, and verbal compliments from Sheridan. Maybe Sheridan was glad to get rid of him. Now, but Gregg also, if you want to pick a couple words that maybe describe Gregg in a semi-negative context, Russell Weigley, professor at Temple many years ago, wrote on General Gregg, and he said, he used 2 words. He said General Gregg was unspectacular. He lacked enthusiasm. Now, there are a lot of other descriptions of these characteristics that kind of counter that, but take your pick. I don't think he was a coward. I'm not sure about post-traumatic stress syndrome. He may have been just fed up. He didn't like Sheridan. He didn't write much about it, but here's another very interesting quote. I don't know what year it was. It was probably sometime in the 1880s or 90s. Gregg was invited to go to a reunion of some kind, and he refused to go. A newspaper reporter came up to him and said, General Gregg, did you not go to that reunion because your former adversaries, General Sickles and General Sheridan, were there? He looked at the newspaper reporter and said, what do you mean by former adversaries? The man of few words. So he might have been upset. He was never considered for command of the total Union cavalry when Grant brought his buddy Sheridan in. Do you mind staying a few minutes, or should I cut it off right at 3? What, do you have any preference?
Keep going.
I wanted to share an interesting story that I'm still doing some research on that I found fascinating. When I was, I guess when I was a teenager, and my dad, who was a retired banker, was a banker in Reading. And I remember one time he said to me that, he said, you know, there's a church out there in Gettysburg that is going to get some money from David Gregg's will. Well, I filed that away. I have that here. I think it's back in the table. You can look at it. I have some things back there in the table. But anyway, a number of years after thinking about that, I thought, well, I'm going to try to figure out what's going on with this. So I went to Gettysburg, and I went to any number of churches that were there at the time of the Civil War, churches that were used for hospitals for soldiers and troopers. And I asked, did you get any money from General Gregg's estate? So I thought, well, I guess there's another way to approach this. I came back home. I went into the Berks County Courthouse. I went to the Prothonotari's office, and I got a copy of David Gregg's will. And in that will, it indicated that there was going to be some money when the trust terminated. And this is the way it worked. Gregg had 2 sons, only one married. The widow of the one that did marry was the last recipient of that trust. And she, as I said, did not pass away until 1980. There were about $15,000 or a little bit more left in that trust. The remainder now was going to be divided. And 1/3 went to the Home for Friendless Children, which is now the Children's Home. 1/3 went to the Protestant Episcopal Clergy Relief Association. And 1/3 went to the Prince of Peace Episcopal Church in Gettysburg. So I went out to Gettysburg, visited the Prince of Peace, and I saw the cornerstone. The church was built in 1880. Now I'm really confused. They were very nice. They showed me their files, and this was the deal. There was never an Episcopal congregation in Gettysburg during the time of the Civil War. There was a little one somewhere else in Adams County. They wanted to build an Episcopal church in Gettysburg, and they had a great fundraising plan. If your family member or somebody you honored, loved, and respected was a Civil War veteran and you wanted to honor them, you could purchase a plaque to be put in their memorial hall. And you could have their name inscribed on that. There are maybe 25 or 30 plaques, even 5 Confederate, in that memorial hall in the Prince of Peace Episcopal Church. And that was an intentional name they chose. This Prince of Peace is to heal the wounds of the Civil War. And when I saw the memorial hall, there's a big plaque with David Gregg's name on it. And the person who sponsored that plaque was nobody in Gregg's family. It was a fellow by the name of Gustavus Nichols. Anybody ever hear of him? Well, he was the superintendent of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. He was a friend and neighbor of Gregg. They both attended Christ Episcopal Church. And he was so, Gustavus Nichols, and he had some money, he was so impressed with David Gregg and his career that he put a plaque up there in his honor in the church. He may have also put some other plaques up there. And I guess David Gregg appreciated that. And that's how, or why, that church is included in David Gregg's will. And they were probably extremely surprised to receive this money. A couple other factors to show you the humanity of David Gregg. How many of you heard of Alexander Schimmelpfennig?
Wasn't that one of the 11th Corps?
11th Corps General, sometimes maybe unfairly named the Pigpen General. When the 11th Corps was literally chased in and out of Gettysburg, Alexander Schimmelpfennig hid in what might have been a pig pen in a yard in Gettysburg to avoid capture. He was in the 11th Corps. He did have a fairly successful career, but he suffered the ignominy of the pig pen and also the defeats of the 11th Corps. And in September of 1865, he died in or near Wernersville, Pennsylvania. Indigent, no money, nothing. David Gregg arranged and paid for his funeral, and General Schimmelpfennig has a much bigger tombstone in Charles Evans Cemetery than David Gregg does. It's in the same area. Speaking about Wernersville, there's also another interesting little event, and I don't know what year it took place, but for a while one of the Gregg homes was being renovated in Reading, he lived in Wernersville. Sometime in the 1870s or perhaps early 1880s, he visited the widow of Stonewall Jackson as she was vacationing at a resort hotel in Wernersville, and he paid his respects. In 1870, he attended the memorial service for Robert E. Lee in Richmond. However, in the early 1900s, he spoke out and vociferously opposed the erection of a monument, an equestrian statue for Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg. There's a paper back there that shows you a little bit of the generosity or courtesy West Point graduates had toward each other. A Confederate general by the name of John Chambliss, a very good Confederate cavalry general and a classmate of Gregg's at West Point, was killed, a month or so after Jeb Stuart was killed. It was some of Gregg's troopers who were responsible for his death. Those troopers looted his body, took his ring, his class ring, and some possessions. When Gregg found out about it, he had General Chambliss's body returned to North Carolina with as much stuff as he could recover to the Chambliss family. The only thing that was not returned was the sword belonging to General Chambliss, which I think is somewhere in Michigan. I've talked a lot. Any questions?
What does he
Yes.
do when he gets out of the war?
Well, not much of anything. He never held a steady job. He briefly tried fruit farming and farming in Milford, Delaware. He did in the 1870s. Well, in 1868, he tried to get back in the Army. Everybody thought he'd get back in. There was a new cavalry unit that needed a colonel. That position went to his cousin, Irvin Gregg. In 1876, I think it was 76, he applied to become a diplomat. And he actually was given a choice as United States consul. Valparaiso, Chile, or Prague in Bohemia. He took Prague. He and his wife, in February 1876, journeyed to Prague. 7 months later, she became homesick and wanted to come home, so they came back. He resigned.
Well, he apparently had enough money to.
I guess.
What how did he get the money? Steal it?
No, I think he had some, he probably inherited some. And I have a feeling she had money. Now, she was related to the Heister family and the Muhlenberg family, both very prominent Berks County families. So I don't think, that's a good question. I don't think money was an issue, but he never really worked. He often would appear for fundraisers. He helped raise funds for the Centennial to preserve the battlefield at Valley Forge in 1878. He organized a relief effort for the victims of the tornado that hit northeast Reading and that silk mill. He lived, though, until a very old age. He didn't die until 1916. So he was the last living, I think, Union general. But he never really held, I forgot to say something very important. I'm sorry I did. He got involved in politics briefly. He ran for state auditor general. And if you have a minute, I'll tell you about politics. This is a presidential election year. You should enjoy this. Things never change. His first connection with presidential politics had come in 1880. Winfield Scott Hancock was the Democratic candidate for president against James Garfield. The Republicans claimed that Winfield Scott Hancock was not suitable for being a president for 3 reasons. One, he was too soft on the Southerners when he was a military governor in New Orleans. Number two, he was drunk at the Battle of Reams Station. And number three, he accepted $50,000 from the Pope for his campaign. One of the last times I spoke in this, it was when John Kerry was running for president, and there was something called a swift boat attack, which kind of is that you attack the military record of your opponent. Gregg, in 1880, when Hancock was running for president, wrote a letter saying that I was with General Hancock all day at Reams Station, and I can assure you he was not drunk. Garfield, one of the other criticisms from the Republicans, one of the interesting criticisms of Hancock was that generals did not make good presidents. And the Republicans cited the abysmal record of a president that U.S. Grant had. They kind of also attacked Hancock's patriotism. The interesting thing is that James Garfield, who was a Republican candidate, had also been a general. But he claimed he was the right kind of general because he was a citizen soldier and he achieved most of his reputation as a member of Congress. So now, in 1891, the Republicans, and Gregg was nominally a Republican, the Republicans had a financial scandal in Harrisburg and they were looking for squeaky clean candidates. And they asked Gregg whether he would run, and he agreed. I guess he needed a job for a little while. So he agreed to run, but in order to be on the ballot, he had to win a Republican primary. He had opposition from a gentleman from western Pennsylvania. What was brought up against Gregg in the Republican primary was that Gregg was like Hancock. He supported Hancock. He wasn't all that patriotic, and that generals did not make good elected officials. Well, Gregg easily won the primary. He won the general election. But if you look at the voting statistics, he just squeaked by in the city of Reading. But he was defeated soundly in Berks County because the Germans of Berks County traditionally always voted for the Democratic candidate. So a Republican war hero could not win Berks County for Auditor General in 1891. He served 3 years, and by all accounts, people said he was happy to get out of Harrisburg. One last, whimsical dream maybe was, there were people who wanted David Gregg to assume a generalship of an infantry unit in the Spanish-American War, 1898, when he was 65. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. But do you know what Confederate cavalry general commanded U.S. forces in the Spanish-American War? Rodney?
Joe Wheeler.
Fighting Joe Wheeler.
And
Joe
he
Wheeler.
forgot which war
He
was.
forgot.
Hot damn, we got them damn Yankees on the run.
Yeah, that was a comment. Speaking about Yankees, there was another. It was interesting. The Englishman Percy Wyndham, when he was captured by the Confederates, was insulted when the Confederates referred to him as a Yankee. He was not a Yankee. He was an Englishman. Yes. Pardon? Oh, yeah. Those of you who are familiar with the Reading area, there are things named for David Gregg. Of course, we have the American Legion Post, Gregg Post, and we do have a Gregg Street in the 18th Ward named after David Gregg. And there are probably some other things I can't recall, but it's it's a real honored name in Civil War history, and there's a lot of books back there if you want to take a look at. And before maybe we do that, any other questions? Thank you for your kind attention. Yes, sir.
Last question. The disastrous review with President Lincoln, is there any record of how many enlisted men were court-martialed for snickering?
Now it'd be interesting. I'm sure they had a good time with it. But I imagine if it was a somewhat disliked Union officer, there would have been a lot more said about it. Maybe they could feel his pain. I don't know. Anybody else? Well, thank you again. It was a pleasure talking to you about General Gregg.